Hello, BookTube. All right, today we're continuing our read-along of Anthony Trollope's series of novels called the Palliser series, or the Parliamentary series. We're finishing it. We're reading the last of the Palliser novels, The Duke's Children, which was published in 1880, which is the same year, coincidentally enough, that the action of our other read-along for the month, Lonesome Dove, takes place. And this, Trollope had a success with the Palliser novels. It wasn't a tremendously dramatic success, like with his previous series of books, but it was still classic Trollope, and I believe he did a lot of great work in these books. I think The Prime Minister is a fantastic book. I think Phineas Redux is a great novel. And then we move on to The Duke's Children, which it's going to strike a lot of you as a twilight work. It's going to strike a lot of you as I would be willing to bet, I hope I'm wrong, I've taught this book before, and when I did, students who had read other Palliser novels thought this seemed a little bit rote. Now, I don't agree with that at all. This is my favorite Trollope novel of them all, and I want to try and explain in the course of this read-along why that would be. But first we have to get past one of the greatest hurdles in English literature, for somebody who has read the other Palliser novels. I warned you about this a long time ago. I've been mentioning this gut punch for the whole time that I've had this channel. It's a profound reading experience for me, so it's on my vocabulary of profound reading experiences. But specifically in the course of the Palliser novels, and specifically after the Prime Minister, the epic events of the Prime Minister, I have been warning those of you who have been reading along that you're in for a shock when The Duke's Children begins. And we might as well go through that together. The shock that I'm talking about is the first sentence of the novel. And I might as well get to it. The title of the first chapter is When the Duchess Was Dead. And the first line of The Duke's Children is, no one probably ever felt himself to be more alone in the world than our old friend the Duke of Omnium when the Duchess died. In the Palliser series of novels, The Duke's Children starts with Lady Glencora dead. She comes back sick from a trip to the continent. She comes back well, is sick for a week, and dies. Catches everybody by surprise, and leaves the Duke utterly destroyed. It was not only that his heart was torn to pieces, but that he did not know how to look out into the world. It was as though a man should be suddenly called upon to live without hands or even arms. He was helpless, and knew himself to be helpless. Hitherto he had never specially acknowledged to himself that his wife was necessary to him as a component part of his life. Though he had loved her dearly and had in all things consulted her welfare and happiness, he had at times been inclined to think that in the exuberance of her spirits she had been a trouble rather than a support to him. But now it was as though all outside appliances were taken away from him. There was no one of whom he could ask a question. That's a tough hurdle to get over. This is a Palliser novel that will not have Lady Glen in it. That's a tough hurdle to get over. It has all of our other characters, including a large number of characters that we're meeting for the first time or getting to know for the first time, most importantly, the Duke's children. There's his two sons, Lord Silverbridge, the heir, and Lord Gerald. And then there's Lady Mary Palliser. Wags and commentators on Trollope's novels just in general have pointed out that somewhere in the course of events the Pallisers lose a daughter because they originally had two. But that I don't begrudge Trollope that at all. It's a very rare mistake on his part, a very rare omission on his part. But nevertheless, the children all adored their mother, and she was a co-conspirator of Lady Mary's, of course, in every endeavor of her young heart, in a way that they couldn't. Their father, we've known, if you've been following these Palliser novels all along, you know the Plantagenet Palliser is barely able to speak his mind, much less his heart. He is a distant, very cold person. We see him in agony quite often, especially when his desire for smooth sailing and dignified bearing has been upset by the madcap plans of his wife. And it's a little bit sobering. It's very sobering to realize at the beginning of this novel that we're not going to have madcap plans like that anymore. But But Lady Glen has one last trouble for her husband in store. There's one last trouble. And the one of the goading points of that trouble is Mrs. Finn, a character that we've known in many books, Madame Max Goesler, who marries Phineas Finn, and who was Lady Glen's closest friend. And is naturally sort of in loco parentis when the catastrophe of this grief strikes the family. She happens to be there and can help with, not so much the boys, but with Lady Mary. But there comes a point when she assumes that the Duke will want to get his children into... Madame Max is not of their level. In the stratified social era of the time, she's very wealthy and she's well thought of, but she's not... The Duke of Omnium is the highest rank of British nobility. He's, as we're told in the chapters that we're reading today, he and his children are one step removed from royalty. And Mrs. Finn starts to feel like maybe, okay, my close friendship with Lady Glen, even when she became Duchess of Omnium, was justified by the fact that we were friends, and nothing could change that. She insisted on it. But when she's gone, I should probably no longer deal with this family on quite so intimate terms. The Duke is blasted and in shattered pieces. He doesn't know one way or another what to do about anything. Suggests maybe that Lady Mary should go to a friend of the family or a distant relative while she's grieving and while he's incapable of even speaking to her. But we don't know one way or another, what Mrs. Finn might want to happen. She tries to be circumspect, but her circumspection is put to the test by the last scheme of her old friend Lady Glen, which is that Lady Mary Palliser has fallen in love with a young man named Frank Tregear, who is a commoner with no income and no profession, no prospects of any kind. He's a close friend of Lord Silverbridge. They were at school together. But he is obviously going to go and work for a living. He's just an ordinary person, in other words. He has a small inheritance that will come his way on his mother's death, but he's not anywhere near, if we're talking about levels, he's not anywhere near the same level as Lady Mary, and yet they have fallen in love. And the match has been encouraged by Lady Glen. Before she died, she was the bosom confidant of her daughter and confided and told her daughter that she supported the match because it was true love. Now, that's going to ring bells for some of you who've been reading these Palliser novels all along, because when we first meet Lady Glen, she herself is severely contemplating a love match with a young man named Burgo Fitzgerald, who came from great money and great status, but who has lost. He's a wastrel. He's lost it all. Doesn't have anything. It would be a disastrous move on her part to marry him. He would soon spend all of her money as well. And her family knows that, and they're against the match. They want to, they advise her to a family-approved match with Plantagenet Palliser, the heir of the Duke of Omnium. She doesn't love Plantagenet Palliser at all, but she agrees. She knuckles under. In a rare departure, most of the young women that we've seen, even in the Palliser series alone, resist that kind of family planning. They set their hearts where they will and marry that way. Lady Glen did not. And one of the sort of serio-comic aspects of her character is that maybe she never quite got over mooning over Burgo Fitzgerald. When we meet Burgo Fitzgerald, we met him much earlier in the series. When we meet him and follow him around a bit, when Trollope's narrative follows him around, we see how worthless he is. And he's just pretty. That's all. Frank Tregear is also pretty. He's compared many times to Apollo in this book. And he is advised by Mrs. Finn, look, you can't keep this secret. You have to go to the Duke and tell him everything. I can't hold this secret for you. If you expect me to do that, then you read me wrong. I will tell him if you don't. So you must go and tell him. Frank Tregear is a wonderful person. He's noble. He's courageous. He's intelligent. Well-spoken. And he agrees. And he goes to the Duke. And they have a wonderful meeting. Just wonderful. I wonder if I marked it. That I could read it for you. The chapter is called "It Is Impossible," let me see. Yes, Frank Tregear writes a one-line note to the Duke of Omnium saying, "My dear Duke of Omnium, If your grace can spare a moment, I think you will find that what I have to say will justify the intrusion. And the Duke of Omnium thinks that it's about Silverbridge, his son, because he knows these two are friends. He has no idea what's coming. And Frank Tregear wastes no time. He says, "Sir, I've come to you to ask to give me the hand of your daughter." And "The hand of my daughter," said the Duke, rising from his chair. "I know how very great is the prize," said Frank, "and how unworthy I am of it. But as she thinks I am worthy—" "She? What she?" "Lady Mary." "She think you worthy?" "Yes, your grace. I do not believe it." On hearing this, Frank simply bowed his head. "I beg your pardon, Mr. Tregear. I do not mean to say that I do not believe you. I never yet gave the lie to a gentleman, and I hope never to be driven to do so. But there must be some mistake in all this." And Frank Tregear says, "I am complying with Lady Mary's wishes in asking your permission to enter your house as her suitor." The Duke stood for a moment, biting his lip in silence. "I cannot believe it," he said at last. "I cannot bring myself to believe it. There must be some mistake. My daughter? Lady Mary Palliser?" Again the young man bowed his head. "What are your pretensions?" "Simply her regard," Frank Tregear tells him. "Of course it is impossible. You are not so ignorant, but that you must have known when you came to me that it was impossible." There was such scorn in his words, and in the tone in which they were uttered, that Tregear in his turn was becoming angry. He had prepared himself to bow humbly before the great man, before the Duke, before this Croesus, before the late Prime Minister, before the man who was to be regarded as certainly one of the most exalted of the earth, but he had not prepared himself to be looked at as the Duke looked at him. "The truth, my Lord Duke, is this," he said, "that your daughter loves me, and that we are engaged to each other as far as that engagement can be made without your sanction, as her father." "It cannot have been made at all," said the Duke. "I can only hope, we both can only hope, that a little time may soften." "It is out of the question. There must be an end of this altogether. You must neither see her, nor hear from her, nor in any way communicate with her. It is altogether impossible. I believe, sir, that you have no means?" "Very little at present, Duke." "Well, how did you think that you were to live?" "But it is altogether unnecessary to speak of such matters as that. There are so many reasons to make this impossible that it would be useless to discuss one as being more important than others. Has anyone other than my family known of this?" he added, wishing to ascertain whether Lord Silverbridge had disgraced himself by lending his hand to such a disposition of his sister. "Yes," said Frank Tregear. "Who has known of it?" "The Duchess, sir. We all had her sympathy and approval." "I do not believe a word of it," said the Duke, becoming extremely red in the face. He was forced to do now that which he had just declared he had never done in his life, driven by the desire of his heart to acquit his wife, the wife he had lost, of terrible imprudence, whose worse than imprudence, of which she was now accused. "That is the second time, my lord, that you have found it necessary to tell me that you have not believed direct assertions which I made you. But luckily for me, the two assertions are capable of the earliest and most direct proof. You will believe Lady Mary, and she will confirm in the one and the other." The Duke was almost beside himself with emotion and grief. He did not know, though now at this moment he was most loath to admit it to himself that it was so, that his dear wife had been the most imprudent of women. And he recognized that in her encouragement of this most pernicious courtship, if she had encouraged it, a repetition of that romantic folly by which she had nearly brought herself to shipwreck in her own early life. And you remember from the Prime Minister that the Duke teased her, saying, "All your geese are swans. You're always championing some handsome young woman." Then it was Ferdinand Lopez. Now it's Frank Tregear, a totally different kind of man. And what follows is a repetition of the plotline that we saw in the Prime Minister. Only now it's in the Duke's own family. The Duke absolutely refuses Lady Mary permission to be seen or courted by a commoner who has no money, who in the Duke's opinion, is courting her for her money, who's courting her expecting that the Duke will make him a wealthy man. Absolutely forbids her permission to do that. And she, like our previous young woman in exactly the circumstance, says, "Okay, if I'm a dutiful daughter, if you tell me that, I will agree, but it will break my heart. I love him, and I will never love anyone else." The Duke is just torn to pieces by this, and it just gets worse. His afflictions in these early chapters just get worse, not only because he finds out that Mrs. Finn knew about it, and didn't come immediately to him. It's a ridiculous accusation on his part, but it arouses his ire. We know right away it's displaced ire at his dead wife. This is a very complex psychological novel, in a way, I think. The Duke doesn't know what to do with his grief and with his shock about losing Lady Glen, and when he's confronted with this latest evidence of her outrageous ideas and her romanticism, he needs to take it out on someone, and she's not around anymore. But it's not just that. It's also that young Silverbridge wants to go into Parliament. He wants to stand for Parliament for the village of Silverbridge, which has long been in the family's gift. And, that might be okay. Plantagenet Palliser might take a certain kind of pride in the son following in his footsteps. So the son wants to stand as a totally opposite political philosophy from his father and from all of his forebears. And that's a source of heartbreak as well, because the Duke of Omnium is an intensely political person, even though he affects to disliking politics. He and his wife, we're told in the beginning of these chapters that we're reading today, when they were traveling on the continent, were longing for the sound of trumpets. They want to get back into the to and fro of the active political life. He's every bit as political a creature as the creatures that he decries. And so the idea that his son would profess the opposition's political opinions is just horrible wormwood to him. But the main drama that we're getting in these early chapters is the drama of the Duke finding out that Mrs. Finn might have been involved, that Mrs. Finn gave her countenance to this. And he sends her a stiff note along those lines. Trollope's letters are great. They are fantastic in this book. And she becomes aware that he thinks that she conspired with Lady Mary against his wishes, behind his back, as an intruder in the family. Really no business of hers whatsoever. It, of course, isn't true. Trollope tells us what's going on. Lady Mary springs this whole idea on Mrs. Finn, and Mrs. Finn advises her and Frank Tregear immediately, if you don't go and tell him, you must go and tell your father. Immediately. It's not my place to trample over anything, but he must know, and without delay. So she does everything right, and later on, other people who are confidants in the matter, exonerate her to the Duke. They say, we know you're outraged by this, but she did everything right. She did nothing wrong at all. And he refuses at first, out of pique, out of anger and pride, he refuses to even discuss the matter with Mrs. Finn. Just writes her off. And she sends him a brief card saying, Mrs. Finn requests that the Duke of Omnium call on her at a time of his choosing. She will be at home in order to explain, in order to discuss this matter. He sends her a very rude note saying that the Duke of Omnium sees no good coming from such an exchange and declines. And so she writes him a letter. And I won't read the whole letter because it's long. It's very good. But she writes him a letter that starts off with, as you will not come to me, I must trouble your grace to read what I fear will be a long letter. And she explains what happened. And we know that it's true. We've seen it happen. She explains that she advised Lady Mary and Frank Tregear separately to make this known to him. There's no good in pursuing this any further without his knowledge and agreement. And when she finishes the letter, she adds a postscript that's just wonderful. It's wonderful to read, but it's like an ice pick. Because we remember that these characters have liked each other in the past. We've been reading about these two and their long relationship with each other for many books now. And this is the postscript. I find, on looking over my letter, that I must add one word further. It might seem that I'm asking for a return of your friendship. Such is not my purpose. Neither can you forget that you have accused me, nor can I. What I expect is that you should tell me that in your conduct to me, that your conduct to me, you have been wrong, and that I in mine to that. Okay, let's start this over. The Victorian prose. What I expect is that you should tell me that you in your conduct to me have been wrong, and that I in mine to you have been right. I must be enabled to feel that the separation between us has come from an injury done to me and not by me. And we feel that the Duke deserves a reprimand like that, but immediately after that, only a few paragraphs after that, we get a wonderful scene that Trollope gives us of how the Duke can be found in his most private closet, his most private study, murmuring his wife's name, Cora, Cora, over and over again. It's in that moment that we remember that despite that reprimand from Mrs. Finn, he is a supremely wounded person. might not justify some of his behavior, but it is the ultimate explanation of a lot of it. And that the chapters that we're reading today go all the way to the chapter called Sir Timothy Beeswax. And that's where we're stopping for now. That is the beginning of things. That is how the Duke's Children begins, with a rift between Mrs. Finn and the Duke, and a much worse rift between the Duke and his children. Not so much Lord Gerald. He's too young. He doesn't really enter into things that much. I would love a book about him. The oft apocryphally rumored 7th Palliser novel about Silverbridge in Parliament and about Lord Gerald would have been great. but the main thrust of these early chapters, there are other characters. We follow Lord Silverbridge in his love life to unbelievably moving effect. There's a character, Lady Mabel Grex, we'll get into her next time, who is one of Trollope's most intriguingly ambivalent characters. But for now, the main thing that we're dealing with here is the rift between the Duke and Mrs. Finn, and the rifts that have started between the Duke and his 2 eldest children. Because Lord Silverbridge wants to espouse a different political philosophy from the one that has guided the Dukes of Omnium forever. And Lady Mary will not give up Frank Tregear. The Duke has absolutely forbidden it. It is absolutely not going to happen, but she won't. She tells the Duke what protestations that we've already heard from other characters in previous Palliser novels, only this time it's right at home with the characters that are at the heart of these series. She tells him, I will obey you, but I will always love him and I will never love anyone else. You will make me miserable if you insist on this. So that's how the Duke's Children begins, and we are now beginning the end of the Palliser read-along that we've been doing all these months. So again, as usual, let me know what you thought of this beginning, not so much the opening sentence. If you've been reading these Palliser novels, I know already what you thought of that opening sentence. It never loses its power to kick me in the stomach. But the rest of it, like, for instance, once you saw that plot was the one being set up, yet another plot in which a virtuous young woman insists that her love for a young man not of her parents' approval is pure, that we're going to go through that again. Did you roll your eyes a little? Did you sigh a little? Or by this point, are you so on Trollope's team that you'll read any plot that he does? He could renew the same plot over and over again, and you wouldn't mind. I confess that's me by this point in the Palliser novels, but I'd love to hear what you thought. So that's where we'll wrap it up for now. We're going to start next time with the chapter called Sir Timothy Beeswax, and we will read for next Sunday to the chapter titled And Then. So there's lots of stuff in store here. There's lots of new territory that this novel covers in addition to some old favorite plot lines. But I want to hear what you think about all of it. So we'll wrap this up for now. But I will be back. Thank you, BookTube.